Alrighty, we're ready to answer the question for you of how to make lobster bisque soup. Now, of course, in this DVD series on soups, you can click on the shrimp bisque or the oyster bisque, and you will find that the procedure, the ingredients, with the exception of the primary ingredient, lobster, shrimp, oyster, whatever, keep in mind there's only 4 really types of bisque soups: crayfish, oyster, lobster, and shrimp. They're the shellfish that are pureable, or that you can get raw. Making a crab bisque is okay if you have raw crab to start with, but you always want to have raw shellfish when you start this soup, okay? So in the case of the lobster bisque, there's a question has come up from time to time among students of mine that making stock out of shells is a desirable thing. Let me answer that question a couple of ways. First of all, shell stock, if you will, tastes like shells, and lobster meat or shrimp meat tastes like shrimp or lobster. Now your soup will take on the flavor of the shells rather than the actual meat itself if you use shell stock in your bisque soup. You will notice as we make this soup today, or any of the other bisques that are in this series, that there isn't any shell stock or any other additive flavors added to it. These soups are proportionately designed in terms of the recipe for them to taste like the primary ingredient without adding any artificial or hyped up artificial flavoring of it, like lobster base or shrimp base. So we're going to answer the question of how this soup is made from scratch. And you'll find out why they charge so much for it in good French restaurants, okay? So let's begin by heating up our soup pan. And I'm going to put some butter in the pan, and then I'm just going to talk about the procedure for a second that we're going to go through. And you will find that this is the same procedure from the shrimp bisque and the oyster bisque. As soon as that butter's melted, we're going to add mirepoix to it, which I have right here, which is measurably accountable to the recipe that's in your PDF, if you can view that on your computer. And we're going to add that to the butter with a little bit of thyme. We're going to cook it halfway. We're going to add the lobster, and we're going to cook that 2/3 or all the way. We're going to add garlic. Then we're going to add white wine and reduce it. We're going to season or flavor the soup with a little bit of tomato concasse prior to the pureeing process. And keep in mind that when you're cutting the vegetables that go into the soup, it doesn't matter too much how they're cut because they're going to be pureed. Ideally, when you're making a bisque and you're going to puree the vegetables, you want to cut them small because it cuts down on the length of time that it takes you to make the soup in terms of cooking the vegetables in the stock until they get to a pureeable state. Okay? Now the butter is melted, and I'm going to add the mirepoix. And continuing on with that procedure, then we'll add some stock after the wine's reduced on top of the garlic, and then we'll add some rice to it because that's what's traditionally used, rice or boiled potatoes, but rice more than anything in terms of traditional French cooking, which is what bisque soup is all about, traditional French soup making in terms of bisque. I will mention, contrary to popular opinion, there are no other bisques besides shellfish bisque. So there really isn't a mushroom bisque out there. That's more of a marketing thing for some big soup company. But we won't get into that too much. We'll make our bisque with a little bit of thyme added to the mirepoix, okay? And I have here some fresh live Maine lobster tails, which we're going to take out of the shell. But back to that business about the shell stock. There are some economic advantages that people in the commercial soup making business, as in restaurants and hotels, etc., they'll sometimes make shell stock as a supplement because they feel that they can't afford to make it with all the actual lobster meat itself, okay? Which I would disagree with that, meaning if you can't afford to make it right, why bother? Make something else that you can make right, you know? These are some very nice looking fresh Maine lobster tails too, I gotta tell you. This recipe calls for 1 pound of uncooked lobster meat. And that we have right here in these 5 to 6 ounce pieces of meat right here. We got about 15, 16 ounces right there. We're going to cut this up, and we're going to use and add that for the soup and the pureeing process. But we're going to take this other tail and we're going to chop it in slightly larger pieces and saute it and use it for garnish on top of the bowls. This is an added touch that would certainly be considered an option. If you can afford to have the lobster as garnish, then do it. If you can't, there's plenty of other garnish options that we'll go over when we're finishing and assembling this soup today. Okay? Okay, let's get this lobster cut up. The mirepoix is almost cooked. And again, you are not browning the vegetables. This is not a brown soup. This is, quote, a white soup, if you will. Okay? Now we're going to, let me give you a little peek at the veggies here. Richard, if you can come down here, you'll see that the vegetable about half cooked, half to 3/4. And that's good because now you're going to add the lobster while the vegetables are finished cooking. And we're going to let that cook. As soon as that's cooked, because you want the lobster to be sauteed prior to adding the stock to it. And we're going to use chicken stock today. And I also have some clam juice on hand. And sometimes you can add a little bit of clam juice too, and you can use that as your stock when you make Bisque soups. Now, some people would recommend, or you will find in various recipes for Bisque soups, the use of fish stock as the primary stock ingredient. Remember, shellfish, which is what the Bisque soups are made out of, are not a fishy kind of tasting thing to begin with. So, although I have done it myself, and I'm not particularly fond of the final result from using fish stock as the primary stock in the Bisque soups, but you can do it. I would kind of put that in your back pocket as an emergency stock. I would go with either white veal and poultry stock, or chicken stock, or clam juice, okay? None of these are fishy, and you don't want to add a fishy flavor to the Bisque soup, because it's not supposed to taste like fish, because it isn't fish. Okay, lobster, about half cooked. Now we're going to add the garlic. And we have some chopped garlic. Now that looks like a lot. I got about 3 tablespoons here, and that's not enough. I'm putting the rest of this in here. So you got about 1/4 cup. Is that what my recipe calls for? 3 tablespoons. So I put about an extra tablespoon in. Okay. Brief cooking on the garlic, being sure not to scorch the garlic or burn it, God forbid, because it will permeate the soup with that flavor, and the flavor of lobster will no longer be dominating the soup. We're going to hit this with the white wine, and I think this recipe calls for 2 cups of white wine, and I got about 1.5 cups in there, 2 cups. There you go. Let's let that reduce for a second. And at this point, we can add the tomato concasse that I recommended we add. Now, this is an option. You don't have to have this tomato concasse in your soup. I think it kind of helps the flavor of the soup, and after you've made this and eaten it, you'll understand why. You can put it in just about anything, and it kind of helps it out a little bit. But you don't need a whole lot, keeping in mind that it's going to be pureed anyway. Now, while the wine is reducing, I'm going to fry some of the croutons that we're going to use in the final presentation for the soup. Now, some people like square croutons. I think round croutons in a round bowl, are particularly good. And I have some clarified butter that I made, and of course, you know, you can click on clarified butter in your introductory DVD for more information on that. But we're going to fry these in clarified butter, And I would say that this is a particularly large shaped baguette, but not too large in terms of the diameter of these pieces of bread, proportionately to the bowl that we're going to serve it in. They're a little bit big, but they're okay. And I want to give you another look at what's going on inside this pot. We have in here the lobster, white wine, mirepoix, garlic, and a little tomato concasse with some butter, reducing. Okay? We're going to slide that to the back here so we can bring the crouton pan to the forefront while that's reducing. Using clarified butter versus whole butter is essential when making croutons for two reasons. One, unclarified butter has water in it. It will make the bread soggy. That would be the biggest reason why you can't do that. And then the other reason is that the casing solids in the butter have a tendency to burn at the level of heat intensity that you'll be making the croutons in. And that's not going to work either. So we have a little bit of clarified butter here. And I got to tell you, these croutons are so delicious made in clarified butter versus toasted in the oven, okay? I'll need a pair of tongs, please, Louis. And in goes the bread. Thank you, sir. Are you getting down on this, Richard? Okay. And watch your bread carefully. And put it on some paper towels, or a little towel. When it comes out, getting close there. And turn that down just a touch. Very close. That thing is reducing away back there, and it's almost done, by the way. All of a sudden, they'll be done, these croutons. See, look at that. 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm going to shut the fire off. It's hot enough to finish them. And we're going to stay right by these croutons. You don't walk away from a pan of croutons because by the time you come back, they'll be burnt. Okay, these are looking good. I'm going to put them on a little napkin and on a little cloth here to drain. We'll set them aside. And you can still make these and store them in an airtight container at room temperature and keep them for 2 or 3 days, and they'll stay nice and crispy. Of course, if they don't, you put them on a little cookie sheet and pop them in the oven and dehydrate them, and they'll get re-crispy. So you have no excuse for soggy croutons now, right? Okay. Let's bring the stock back to the forefront, and I will show you now at what point it has been reduced. And it is about 75% reduced on the wine, you see? There's not too much liquid left in that pan, all right? Did you get that, Richard?
Yeah.
Okay. Now we're going to crank that up, and we're going to add the chicken stock. Now, I think this recipe calls for about a quart. And I never use a recipe when I make this, but I do it on in these lessons because I want you to do it. So this calls for a quart and a cup. We'll add a little bit there. Let's give that a mix and see how that looks. Just add a pinch more. And this recipe calls for blanched, boiled, plain white rice as the thickening agent. And we're going to put that in there. We're going to be careful not to add too much rice to this pot because we can't take the rice out. There's a limit to how thick you will need to make this. And I'll need that round little sautoir pan right there to make right in front of me here on the table to reduce the cream in. Now, this recipe also calls for you to reduce the cream to sauce consistency, thank you, and add it to the soup. That's a good policy to have when you're making this kind of soup because you don't want to thin the soup out as you're adding the cream at the end. And there's no reason to add the cream prior to the end. And there are plenty of reasons not to. All right? So let's crank that up. And let's throw a couple of cups of cream in here. And the roundness of this pan makes it especially good for reducing cream in it because it tends to boil over less because it has so much space for the heat to expand or escape from. So get yourself a couple of cups of cream there. Okay, now we're going to move the camera forward about 5 to 7 minutes, 8 minutes, and this is going to be a quick time elapse of about 7 minutes while this boils and the food becomes pureeable. And you don't need to cook the soup at this point any more than it takes to puree it with your blender stick, okay? So I'll be back right now in about 7 or 8 minutes, okay? Okay, the 7 or 8 minutes has elapsed, and sure enough, the stuff's ready to be pureed. Let's take the pot that has been simmering now for probably a total of maybe 10 minutes, which is all it takes. And let's pour it into a container that is shaped in such a way as that turbulence that will be created when we puree with the stick is perfect for pureeing the product, okay? And that would be a tall cylinder versus a wide pot like this, which should take you forever. You'll burn your blender stick out trying to puree these huge wide pots, okay? So let's dump this in here. Just give me a little rinse on that, please, Louis, because I don't want any leftover little pieces of food, non-pureed, floating around inside the soup. All righty, let's give this a zap. You, of course, can batch puree this if you need to in your food processor. And the way to do that, let me tell you before we even puree this, is to strain the food out of the juice and puree the food, wet food, in the food processor, then add it back into the juice. That's how you puree the soup in a food processor. You don't put the liquid in the food processor. The other way, of course, is in a stationary stand-up blender, like a bar blender or anything else. Be careful that you don't fill it up because it'll come popping out at the top. Fill it about 2/3 of the way full, a regular blender, okay? And make sure the top is down tight before you start it, and start it out slow. Otherwise, it'll come flying out on you, all right? So let's zap this with our little portable blender. Again, I'd like to say that the best movement method for the portable blender is not stationary sitting on the bottom. That will burn the blender out. Thank you, Louis. But instead is to keep it moving in a circular fashion a little bit off the bottom of the container. This is the best location for the turbulence in the pot to puree the food the fastest. Let me have one of those small 2-quart stainless steel inserts. I want something even, no, a smaller version. I brought one, it's over here somewhere. Look inside the, there it is. I'm going to transfer this to even a smaller cylinder because I'm not getting the puree action that I want. That's it, perfect. Thank you. I'll get even a tighter set of turbulence in this. I just have to do it in a couple of batches. Nice and hot. It's really pureeing it in here now. Okay, that works for me. Let me show you the amount that this has been pureed on a plate so you can get an idea. There's a little bit of texture left in there, but not very much. And it looks like lobster meat in there because that's what it is. This is not a fake lobster bisque soup. Okay, let's put this back in the big pot. And let's puree the rest of this. I think I can get away with that. Let's see, maybe not. I don't think so. I don't feel like burning myself again. Hold on. This little container is not the kind of container that you move this thing around and you splash it on your fingers. Okay, that looks good. Now we have one small more, whoa, cream. Cream is reduced over here. Really reduced, look at that. Now part of that's burnt on the bottom. See, even I have to watch what I'm doing, but here is a good example of this cream is okay to use. It's just really, really reduced. The bottom's scorched, but the cream is not burnt at all, okay? Let's just put this aside. We'll add it to the soup when it's supposed to be added. We'll take a little bit of clam juice here to rinse this out. Okay, let's give this a final zap. Now, you'll notice that I started out with one container, but I needed to make an adjustment to a smaller container because I didn't like that it was being pureed. Never be bound by the equipment that you're working with. You need to move and switch up to get the result that you want when the time comes. Okay. Okay, back in the pot. Now we're going to turn the fire on in the pot. Excuse me. And the soup is just a pinch too thick. But before we decide that we want to start adding stock to it to thin it out, let's do the finishing process on this soup with the butter and cream first, because that is going to affect the texture also. So we're going to take about 4 ounces of whole butter, which is it's 2 ounces per quart proportionally for buttering the soup, or any soup for that matter. And this stuff is boiling enough right now to take it off the fire and finish it over here in front of you. And let's take this cream that has been completely reduced and add it to it. And let's get the zapper back in here now. I want to get the butter completely incorporated into the soup. Okay, we're going to stop right there. We're going to taste this. I want you to see what this soup looks like right now. It tastes good right now. And we're not finished with this soup, of course. First, we're going to take about 2 or 3 ounces of brandy, and we're going to burn it off in a pan. Now, burnt brandy is not literally exactly how it sounds. You never actually burn anything, except you cause a flame, okay? And there it is. That thing heated up really fast. That would not be the proper way to do this. You wouldn't normally take a bottle and pour it into a hot pan, but that pan got hot so fast I didn't expect it to be that hot. It caught fire right away. Because if you do that, sometimes the flame will shoot right into the bottle. The bottle could even explode. So, of course, there was no brandy in this one, so it probably wouldn't do that. But you'll notice how it's burning. You can shut it off now, and it'll continue burning. You don't have to boil it while you're burning the brandy. Now, the definition of burnt brandy would always be the brandy is cooked like this until the flame stops. Then all the alcohol flavor is gone, and all we're left with, excuse me, is concentrated aged white wine, which is what this is. So really, this is just another form of a white wine reduction that we're adding to this in the form of oak barrel aged brandy. You certainly can use cognac, and you can also add the brandy to it when it's not 100% burnt out. Like right now, it's almost done being burnt out, and I can add this to the soup while it's still burning even, see? It was just about done. And sometimes that little teeny weeny taste of alcohol is okay, and that's the only reason I did that, see? Okay, the soup is coming along nicely. Now I'm going to take that same pan that I just burnt the brandy in, and we're going to saute the lobster that we're going to use for garnish for the soup. Then while that's cooking, we're going to come back and touch this up a little bit. So I'm going to cut the lobster into the size pieces that I think you should use for the soup. You don't want them too big, but you don't want them too small. You want it to be noticeably a piece of lobster, not unidentifiable as maybe a shrimp, maybe a lobster, you know. Okay, see what I got there? All right, let's get this in the pan. And let's give her a little bit of salt and pepper. This pan might be in the way here. A little bit of salt. A little bit of pepper. I'll take the cream that's in the dairy, the white thermos over there. Thank you. Now we're going to douse the lobster with a little teeny bit of white wine too. And that will give you another little added flavor to the lobster. Thank you. Okay, we've done all the pureeing that we need to do with this stick. This soup, I'm going to show you the texture right now, is pureed as much as it needs to be. Now I think it's just teeny weeny bit too thick for me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a little bit of cream to it because it really didn't get that much cream. It got reduced so much, even though I had the flavor. I want that creaminess here to the soup. But remember, this is not a cream soup. It's a bisque soup that has cream in it. So never think that cream is the base for this soup. The base for this soup is mirepoix and stock, or celery, carrots, and onions and stock. Okay? Okay, and there's our lobster that we're going to use for the garnish. So now we have chopped parsley, which I'm going to use, and we have cooked pieces of lobster meat, and we have croutons, and that's all we're going to need for this soup. Let's give it a final taste, and one of the things that this soup is traditionally seasoned with during the finishing stage is cayenne pepper. Normal black ground pepper is not used traditionally in bisque soup. But first, let's have a taste of this. The soup is good. This soup needs a little bit of sugar. This soup needs some of the cayenne pepper. Being careful with this cayenne pepper, you don't want the soup getting too hot unless you specifically want it that way. I'd be careful about serving it to other people with too much cayenne pepper in it. And this soup needs a pinch of sugar. And this soup needs a pinch more of clam juice. It's just still a little bit too thick. Now let's give it a taste. This soup needs a little bit more salt. This soup needs a teeny bit more sugar, and a teeny bit more pepper, and a teeny bit more cream. And I think we're there. This process, which you see me going through, is consistent with all of the approaches to finishing your food. The tasting, the seasoning, adjusting of the flavor additives, and the salt and pepper. There's no other way to do this. And just be aware of that. Let's have another taste of this. Let's have one more taste of it. It's good, but I just want to be completely sure. This soup is good, just the way it is. I'm not doing anything to it. Now, excuse me, we're going to get it in a bowl. Both a white bowl and a color printed bowl, so you can see a couple of different looks for this soup. Now, when we make the oyster bisque, you will see that I have a whipped cream, obviously with salt and pepper in it, not sugar. Fresh whipped cream with fresh herbs in it is one of the garnishes. It's a nice option for the bisque soups. And there you go. You see the texture of that soup? Seems to be just right for me. Okay, don't overfill these soup bowls because by the time you get them to the table where you're going, they'll be sloshed all over the place. So let's take a little bit of the lobster and garnish the soup with it. Each one. And let's give, these croutons are fairly big. Let's just give them one crouton. Obviously, when you're serving this soup, you have bread on the table with it, okay? And let's do a little bit of chopped parsley here. I don't think this soup needs much more than this. What you're looking for here in this kind of low-level presentation is a kind of an understated elegance. This soup itself is so delicious and properly made that it doesn't need a lot of huffing and puffing all around it to make it come off good when the person eats it. So there you go. There's your lobster bisque. And again, I wrapped up the shrimp bisque and the oyster bisque lessons with the same statement, and I'll make it again right now. These bisque soups, the shrimp, the lobster, and the oyster that are made in this course, are all made the same way. The only thing that's different is the primary ingredients or the garnishes. So there you have it. Really delicious and elegant lobster bisque. I hope you get a chance to make this and enjoy it.